I just copy the line, this, no? Just unmuted channel. On the main page. Can you start the webinar? Yeah. Can we start it? Yeah.
All the best.
Okay, guys, so we're going live. Good evening, everyone. I am Aditi Sajwan, and just a second, we have a technical glitch. Allow access.
People are just joining, give them time.
I'll give it another minute. We can start off because we're just setting the ground rules. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I am Aditi Sajwan, and I lead the public engagement function at the Biodiversity Collaborative. On behalf of the collaborative, I welcome you all to the third roundtable discussion of Biodiversity's Ask series. Today, we are going to explore an intersectional topic that impacts our everyday, yet somehow slips through the cracks. I'm talking about biodiversity loss and its impact on mental health. Before I go forward, I just want to announce a few housekeeping rules. If you have any question as an attendee, please put that in the Q&A box. We will take the questions toward the end. Again, a warm welcome. As a young professional working at the cusp of environment and social issues, I've been fortunate enough to look at good, impactful work on the ground. But somehow one big news on a regressive environment legislation distresses me, and a lot like me, making us feel like the doomsday is not very far. Today, we can't deny the impact of mental health because of this crisis that's going on. We can't deny it when indigenous communities whose lives are so intertwined with nature face loss of lives, livelihoods, but also experience an ecological grief which is beyond the measurable. We can't deny its impact when children are kept out of school, not because of choice, but because of the toxic environment, because of the smog that we all are subjected to. We can't deny the impact when young activists, 12 or 16 years old, rise from the corners of Mollem, RA, or the banks of the world to fight for people and nature, and yet are put behind the bars for fighting the just battles. What happens to their psyche? Today, we have numbers for everything, and I believe we are getting closer to calculating the rates at which species are lost. We are getting closer to calculating the economic, ecological costs of this crisis. But how long will it take for us to talk about the inner crisis? To address this very issue, I have a very interesting bunch of people, a very diverse panel that I'm very excited to talk about. Our first panelist is also the youngest speaker we've had so far on this platform. It is Gauri Singh, a 17-year-old climate activist, and also a co-team member in Youth for Climate India. Very proud of you, Gauri. You give us hope. Youth for Climate India is a youth-led climate action group that educates, mobilizes, and empowers youth across India to make climate justice a priority for people and politics. Gauri extensively explores this complex intersection of society, focusing on gender-based inequalities in her writings and academic projects. Gauri, thank you for joining us today. Today, 3 in 4 young people experience eco-anxiety. And as I did my research, it also dawned on me that no previous generation of children have grown up in a crisis so severe. You are that generation. What are your thoughts? What are some of the ways in which you and the larger movement, the youth-led climate action movement, are addressing these concerns? The floor is yours, Gauri.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Aditi. So today, I don't come to you as an expert or a very seasoned speaker, but I'm coming as a teenager who carries a very heavy burden on my shoulders. It's a way that many of us, especially the young people, share today. It's the burden of eco-anxiety. It isn't just a term that we find in textbooks or research paper. It's real. It's personal. It's the feeling that creeps into our hearts when you realize that the world we are inheriting is a planet in peril. It's the anxiety that grips us when we read about wildfires consuming forests, when we see species disappearing faster than we can comprehend, and when we hear about melting ice caps and rising sea levels. It's the fear for a future that keeps us up at night. But this eco-anxiety isn't just about the environment. It's also about how climate and biodiversity crises are affecting the mental health of my generation in an overall perspective. There's a constant barrage of grim news that we see all in the media around us about new climate-related disasters and how it's impacting the world. All of this takes a toll on us. It's not just the fear, but it's the grief too. It's the grief for the loss of the natural world we once knew, for the extinction of species we have graced this earth for eons, and for the uncertainty of what lies ahead. It's as if a piece of our very souls is chipped away with each heartbreaking headline. See, I come from a city where the air quality and pollution is constantly in a very deteriorating state. So to grow up in a place where I have to wear masks just to step outside and be able to breathe freely, if that's not what paints like a picture in your head about how bad situation is, then I don't know what else can. And then comes the sense of powerlessness. We are told, that the future is on our hands, but it often feels like we're fighting a battle against forces that are too enormous to conquer. It's like all the time we have this question, can we really make a difference, or will our actions ever be enough? As a teenager, it can be incredibly frustrating and disheartening to feel powerless in the face of climate change. There are a lot of reasons. I'll share one of them. The most significant one is the lack of control. Most of us can't vote or make laws, and the major decisions about climate policies are often in the hands of the older generations. It feels like our fate is being determined by others, and it's really tough to accept. Then there's this time pressure. We see deadlines like 2030 or 2050 for achieving certain climate goals, and it's hard to imagine how much worse things will get if we don't meet them. There's this ticking time clock that's adding immense pressure. Then there's the complexity of the issue of climate change as a whole. It involves science, economics, politics, and societal changes. For a teenager like myself, it can be very overwhelming to try to understand all the intersectionalities and the intricacies and figure out how we can contribute to the movement meaningfully. There's the scale at which climate change is happening today, it's very overwhelming. We're talking about global problems like rising temperatures and species extinction. It's very tough to wrap our heads around this fact, around the enormity of it all, and believe that our actions can actually make a difference. The most biggest problem that I would personally say is the resistance to change. Sometimes it feels like we're pushing against a massive wall of resistance. There are industries and individuals who profit from the status quo and they resist change. It can be difficult to fight such powerful opposition. Then there's a generational divide. So some older people may not take our concerns very seriously, and they very easily dismiss our activism as idealistic. Like, you guys are kids, what are you doing? Just go back and study. This can make us feel like our voices aren't being heard or we're not being taken seriously. And then there's the media overload. While it is playing a very crucial role in raising awareness about climate change, it is also contributing to the sense of powerlessness. Constant headlines about disasters and inaction, it can create a feeling of doom that's very hard to escape. In some places, climate education is also incomplete or it's lacking. So without a solid understanding of the science and the solutions, it's challenging to feel empowered to take action. But here's the thing. Amidst this anxiety and grief and helplessness, there's something incredible happening. There's something that's tying us together. There is a spark of hope that is igniting a fire within us, a fire that refuses to be extinguished. And that is the youth-led climate action movement. Our generation is rising to the challenge. We're taking to the streets, the classrooms, and the digital spaces to demand change. We are speaking out, and we're saying enough is enough. It's not just about saving the planet. It's about saving ourselves, our mental health, and our collective future. The Youth-led Climate Action Movement is addressing our concerns in extremely powerful ways. First of all, it's providing us a sense of community. When you're part of a movement that shares your worries and your dreams, it's like finding a second family. We know that we're in this together, and that solidarity brings a sense of comfort that helps us fight this feeling of helplessness. Second, it's empowering us. It's showing us that we can actually make a difference, whether it's organizing small scale tree planting events in our neighborhoods, advocating for greener policies, or simply just making efforts to educate ourselves and people around us. That means that we are taking action. Third, it's acknowledging our mental health. It's recognizing that eco-anxiety is an actual problem. So many climate action nowadays, they offer support groups and resources for the emotional toll that this fight takes on us. What most of us fail to realize is that all of this work, it can be very draining emotionally. And I've already spoken about how overwhelming it can get. So they understand that we can't save the world if we're not taking care of ourselves. And that comes first. And most important of all, it's amplifying our voices. We are no longer the generation to be silenced or dismissed. We are standing up and speaking truth to the power. We are holding leaders accountable and demanding action. But what's truly remarkable, in my opinion, is how this movement connects the dots between climate, biodiversity, and human well-being. It recognizes that these issues are interwoven and that the loss of biodiversity affects us just as much it does as the creatures we share this planet with. When we talk about biodiversity loss, we're not just talking about the disappearance of exotic animals from distant lands. We are talking about the actual collapse of ecosystems that provide us with clean air, fresh water, and the food we eat. Basically, everything that's essential to our existence. We're talking about the delicate balance of life on Earth and how our actions disrupt that balance. Think about it this way. When bees disappear due to habitat destruction and pesticide use, our food supply chain is threatened, right? When deforestation robs orangutans of their homes, it's not just the orangutans who suffer, it's all of us who depend on those forests to absorb carbon dioxide and regulate our climate. So when we fight for biodiversity, we are fighting for ourselves. When we fight for a climate, when we fight for a stable climate, we're fighting for our mental health. And when we fight for the planet, we're fighting for our future. Let me leave you with this. Eco-anxiety is a very real thing, and the challenges that we are facing are immense. But remember this too. The hope is real and the power of youth is unstoppable. We're not just the victims of this crisis, we are also the champions of change. Together, we can heal our planet, protect our mental well-being, and create a brighter future for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Gauri. That was really powerful. And thank you for starting on such a hard-hitting note. I mean, I have a very complex emotion right now. As much as I'm distressed about the crisis, it also gives me hope, hearing the future generation about you. And also, you brought home the point that young voices are equally important or even more important, right? Because the stakes are too high for you. So more power to you and your friends for really fighting out the battles which a lot of the other generations are not so equipped for. So yeah, thank you. And on that note, I also want to talk about another important section of the society that's disproportionately affected by the crisis. I'm talking about the indigenous communities who live in ecologically sensitive areas, people who have developed a very intimate connection with their land through generations. And while they may not have a mainstream vocabulary to express the so-called complex emotion, it doesn't mean they're not experiencing it. It doesn't mean they're not talking about it. On that note, I invite our next speaker, Pavitra Vasudevan. A little about Pavitra. Pavitra is a psychotherapist and a community mental health practitioner. She has worked with Adivasi communities in the Nilgiris to address mental health and well-being. Currently, she works at Dakshin Foundation in coastal ecosystems with communities in Odisha and Andaman Nicobar Islands. Welcome, Pavitra, to this conversation. Pavitra, I wanted to ask you that, you are so embedded in this conservation environment space, and ecologists, economists, even social scientists have looked at different facets of biodiversity loss and what it does to us. But what would someone in your position say about it? What are some of the manifestations on the ground? Because there's not so much that we hear about what's out there. I'm very curious to know what's going on in the minds of the vulnerable communities you engage with on a day-to-day basis. Over to you, Pavitra.
Thanks for the introduction, Aditi. Am I audible and
Yeah.
right?
Loud.
All right. So today, when we think of interlinkages of climate change, biodiversity, and mental health, we know it's very nuanced and complex. Today, when we focus on some of these narratives, it's from marginalized communities who also reside in high biodiversity areas, which means that they're more susceptible to climate change impacts. The context that I draw upon are from Adivasi communities who are from the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, who are also particularly vulnerable tribal groups. And they're largely subsistence farmers, they're pastoralists and artisans, and also from small-scale fishing communities in Orissa and in the Andamans who have in some cases also migrated. Inherently, when we think of the social fabric of Adivasi communities and small-scale fishing communities, it is unique and distinct. However, they historically have always resided in spaces that is very close to the environment and to natural resources where their life and livelihoods are very interlinked to the health of the environment and in the ecological setting. While there are differences in the ways of lives, the common stressors that arise from the biodiversity loss, which impacts their livelihoods and in turn their quality of life and well-being, are very similar. So if you want to kind of explore two narratives of one of the Adivasi community where they're deeply and especially of Adivasi communities who are into subsistence farming, their lives are interdependent on farming and collection of non-timber forest produce for their livelihoods and for food security. While in small-scale fishing communities, they rely largely on sea and for fishing and aquaculture for their daily life, which also brings in fish catches and access to these resources become very crucial, which is from land and sea. And when we bring the layer of impact of climate change and the loss because of this biodiversity, it comes with this large, looming, and undeniable change that we can't miss. And we kind of see it when we hear about irregular rainfall impacting a successful harvest season, or alternate wind patterns that impact the catch of the fish that they go for when they go for fishing trips, or in the additional time that they would have to go away from the coast to get the same amount of fish that they would get like a couple of decades back. So, and all of these happen in harsh, unpredictable climatic conditions as well. So when there's like, and when we talk and discuss with communities, they always say how their life is dependent on the sea and what the sea would give and what the land gives to them, and that's what their life consists of. But somehow these unpredictabilities and uncertainties of livelihoods also require other livelihood measures. And what it has done is also to like look for other sustainable, viable livelihoods. So with this, there is like a disappearance or an erosion of traditional knowledge, which also held resilience to the environment through this knowledge that exists. So there's this sense of grief and loss, not from, if not from the same context that we would articulate it, but also in a different cause in terms of attachment and how they kind of perceive this loss in their worldview. And somehow when we discuss mental health and well-being, it's driven by a Western and a very pathological stand, which does not take into account this crux of this mental health issue that brings the whole environment and an ecological setting, and it goes unaddressed in most of these cases. Therefore, it becomes more important to represent community voices and their lived experiences in the discourse of mental health, including biodiversity loss and climate change, because all of these are not parallels but embedded into each other. Something else that I want to kind of also bring to light is how there's a power and resource distribution centering climate change impacts. And I want to highlight how there's a shock and a stressor. And when we talk about climate shocks and stressors, how it impacts marginalized communities can be different. And over here, when I say climate change influence stressor, it could be in terms of heat waves, monsoon failures, changing fruiting patterns, decline in fish catches, which are more sustained, has a more long-lasting effect on their livelihoods and life. Whereas the shocks could be in terms of cyclones, forest fires, landslides, floods, which are very fast to occur, but also have drastic impacts, especially in high biodiversity areas in coastal regions and in the islands. So it's worth noting that in this disparity, the climate change resilient infrastructure or climate funding is more geared towards urban or well-resourced setups as opposed to rural setups, which are high biodiversity zones where there's very limited healthcare access, which also face harsher impacts of these climate change shocks and stressors. And in this, we also kind of forget the narrative of a physical and a psychological impact. And the psychological impact in many cases is more long lasting. And we've seen it when we walk down with community members, and if there has been like a cyclone many years back and we go to the same place, they recollect it, and it brings those memories of distress. And in also in these memories of distress, there are ways of coping, but the narratives are not captured enough to highlight both of these things to the forefront. And also to think of natural and state disaster funds. It's always geared to bringing more climate resilient infrastructure and response for infrastructure in terms of medicines, in terms of equipping people at being in when there is a disaster, but hardly for psychological impacts. And this gap kind of exacerbates on the stresses that's on their livelihoods, which kind of perpetuates the cycle of debt, poverty, poor health, and then of mental health as well. In this context, like resources could be more distributed, considering social inequities. And when we address climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, we need to look at both the stressors and shocks, and how community mental health resilience narratives also need to be weaved into these resilience that we want to think of. And the last thing that I kind of want to highlight is also when we talk about climate change impacts and biodiversity loss, there's always a tone of overwhelming distress, and it's heavily jargoned, and it some ways also alienates us from how we connect to our everyday lives. There's a rush to want to change. And Gauri was also talking about this, how there's an urgency to act, which is very essential. But somewhere in the rush to do this, we forget how we are always also responding to the problem. It could be most communities, it could be us, all of us are responding to the problem, and it requires the visibilizing the problem to say that how we're responding to the problem to also be in the forefront. And in this also to have traditional and ecological knowledge, which is sometimes more geared and nuanced to alerting about impacts. And it also brings communities coping and solidarity together in the knowledge. And some ways that we can see that today is in terms of fish catches, or where you could go and fish, or in harvest protocols. So even if there is an erosion of this knowledge, how do we kind of visualize this narrative when we're talking about adaptability of biodiversity loss? And this could be in ways of building a sort of a toolkit with communities, equipping youth, a psychological toolkit to prepare for all of these shocks and stressors, which fosters connection, somewhere like a mycelial network of support that's not just in one geographical location, but in many places. So yeah, like climate change can be something that amplifies threats and magnifies issues, especially of biodiversity health. The invisible thread that connects human lives to action, response, and thriving is mental health. So when we represent these narratives, I think it requires a connected narrative, and especially to bring to the forefront communities who face these inequities at the margins, and also to focus on breaking these disruptive cycles that are very continual in process.
Yeah, I second you there, and thank you for putting it so in such a well put manner. and also sort of taking us through a virtual tour from these terrestrial ecosystems of Nilgiris to the coastal ecosystem of the communities in Odisha and Andamans. And I really like the point where you say that we need to center marginalized voices in this evolving discourse of mental health and biodiversity loss. Because as standalone topics, these topics have a lot of traction, but it's really the intersection that we are really missing. So I think this conversation that way is also a starter to really double click on the gap that we are facing and what people should really look at. And also for bringing home the point that, communities are already disadvantaged, and there are different axes of discrimination which really perpetuates their marginality. And it's really interesting to hear work of community health practitioners, because a lot of times we individualize mental health problems, right? So what about people who live together, who share ecosystems together, the livelihoods are sort of weaved together. So when people face loss at a community level, how do one make sense and deal with it? So more power to you for your work that you do with these communities. Now I want to move on to our next speaker. So far, we've been talking about the destruction nature has caused and how it's been hurting us. Right? But I also feel we need to look at the other side, as in how nature can heal us as it has for generations. On that note, I invite our next speaker, who is a practitioner of nature-based therapy for trauma healing. We have Tanya Ginwala, who is a psychologist and an adventure and nature-based therapist. She's passionate about intersectionality between adventure, nature, disability, and mental health. She's also the Indian representative in the Indian International Adventure Therapy Committee. Welcome, Tanya. You're doing really cool work, and we all want to be a part of it because it really resonates with us. Because there's a growing body of evidence which says that urban city folks are increasingly becoming disconnected from nature, right? We read it almost every day. So from your experience, could you shed light on the extent of this disconnection and tell us how nurturing this connection with nature can help us deal with this crisis better? Over to you, Tanya.
Thanks, Aditi. So as a nature-based therapist, I do believe that the rupture and disconnect from the natural world deeply impacts and is intertwined with our biopsychosocial well-being and the health of our planet. And there's definitely a mental health emergency within this climate crisis. So intersectional conversations like this one are really the need of the hour, and they fuel me with hope. So I really want to thank each one of you for being here. It's incredibly challenging to talk about an issue as complex and multi-layered as this one in under 10 minutes, but I'm going to give it a shot, and I'm going to try to focus more on solutions and how we can respond collectively and individually. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are dealing with a systemic problem and that we need systemic change, not climate change. We need to reframe climate anxiety as climate compassion, for it isn't something to be pathologized. So fear, anger, grief, terror, and sadness are very valid, appropriate emotional responses to the state of our world today. And they can drive distress, but they can also be harnessed for meaningful and courageous climate action, as we've seen already with the speakers earlier. And it's possible to be thoughtful about how we approach this. And I really believe that climate anxiety isn't something to be soothed, but instead it's something to turn towards in community, just like we are now, and find ways to express and engage with it. So we know that climate change emergencies and biodiversity loss are deeply linked with psychosocial distress and structural oppression, and that not everybody is impacted equally. And we know that multiple marginalized identities can compound on each other to increase one's risk to climate change. So, for example, folks with disabilities live at the intersection of all of these systems of oppression, and they're significantly at a higher risk. And often they're left behind in activism efforts. And also people who live in intimate relationship with quickly changing landscapes, like farmers and tribal communities and indigenous populations worldwide, are also specifically more vulnerable. And here in Himachal, we've been witnessing the impact of climate change and biodiversity loss on the local Gatti community quite closely. So the Gaddis are a fast vanishing agro-pastoral community in the Himalayas. And our outdoor therapy programs collaborate with projects such as the Kareri commune, which is a homestay in a quaint Gatti village with around like 30 houses. And the project aims to support the preservation of Gatti culture and wisdom and generate livelihoods for the youth and the women in the community, and to slow down urban migration as well, while restoring dignity and valuing the lived experience and Gatti wisdom from centuries. So recently we lost the last shepherd in Noli, and it brought up deep grief and questions for us around, what has been lost with him, and how do we meaningfully engage with and preserve these wise ways of moving through the world. And I really feel this need for the guidance of elders now more than ever. And what does that really mean for us? So through our interaction with the Gatti community, and of course they are our guides on the trail and our support system to navigate through the mountains. And through this process and this relationship, we learn to give space to indigenous knowledge and harmonious ways of coexisting with nature. And together we can have conversations around redefining narratives around development and progress and what that means to each of us, and restoring dignity and respect for the community by valuing their lived experience and wisdom. And it's really important that adventure and nature-based therapy doesn't exclude the local community. So the question is really, how can we slowly repair the ruptures created by colonialism, capitalism, and navigate how to journey together with local communities and heal ourselves and the natural world in the process. And together, I really believe that we can discover very inclusive, creative, and innovative and resilient strategies to preserve this rich heritage. So I'll talk a little bit about how trauma and systemic oppression disrupt safety and stability in our bodies. So an important point is that oppressive systems and oppression in general really relies on our disembodiment and disconnection. And nature-based therapy has the potential to support us to slowly find our way back to connecting with ourselves and our bodies, with community, with the land, and the more than human world. And people who've experienced trauma and oppression can scaffold that process of feeling safe in their bodies by beginning to feel safe in nature, with animals, and in a facilitated small group therapeutic setting. And nature connection work is subtle but vital. And we know that there's like a critical interrelationship between nature connection and nature conservation. So it's really clear that we protect and care for what we feel connected to. So conservation work really needs to begin with nature connection work. And if we do nature connection work as practitioners, we also have the responsibility to do grief work, because when we facilitate that connection, there's bound to be grief that comes up. And so that's something that's also important. And basically, I think we need spaces to be in right relationship with the land and sit with the pressures of climate change in community. And we need to create inclusive spaces for the most marginalized communities and folks who've experienced trauma, to experience physical, social, emotional safety out in nature. And this is the need of the hour. And adventure and nature-based therapy also has the potential to facilitate lasting change and create a very contrasting somatic experience to the unease and urgency that we're usually feeling on a daily basis. And here, I think it's really vital to mention the psychological toll on frontline workers like climate activists, journalists, conservationists, and policymakers, and also people like us who are showing up to these conversations. So again, just to ask, like, how can we support our nervous systems to be resilient in the face of the climate crisis? I learned from a peer somatic coach and body worker, Selin Nurkin, that often when we're jumping into action or in the flow of urgency, we start to replicate the very systems that we want to push against. We end up being pushed and pulled and prodded and show up exhausted, hopeless, and too overwhelmed to take any kind of sustainable action. And if we really want to move towards liberation and justice and a true transition, we need to be practicing it in ourselves. We need to feel what it's like to already have that world. And thinkers and revolutionaries such as Audre Lorde talk about rehearsing the worlds that we want to see. So how can we go towards something and build it if we don't know what it feels like? This micro-activism, as well as understanding our felt senses and cultivating that connection, ripples out in the world. It ripples into our communities. And it ripples out into people who come in contact with us because we read each other's bodies and we're innately wired to connect and co-regulate with each other. So we really have to figure out how to sustain ourselves for the long haul, right? And everybody's answer can be different depending on the culture they're from, the community they're from. But it's important to ask, how can we live with this urgency without being in it constantly? And it leaves us with many choices of how we want to be involved, and each of us has a different role to play. So although the problem is really complex, learning more about somatic approaches to healing, I'm slowly realizing that perhaps the solutions need not be as complex as we imagine them to be. And also interacting with the Gadi community has taught me this, that it's often not very elaborate, complex solutions that we're looking at. So really asking this question of how can we practice the world we want to live in this very moment. And that's why it's really important, I feel, for nature lovers, climate activists, health professionals, conservationists to take time to connect with nature, to rest, to rejuvenate our nervous systems, on hope, on inspiration, on motivation and resilience, and move towards solutions that emphasize this beauty and interconnectedness of nature and move beyond just presenting dystopian ways of to present this problem in very dystopian ways. So I just want to invite you right now to take a deep breath and to stretch, to move, to drink water if you need to relax your body in whatever way you can in this very moment as you take in all of this information. And it's just asking, is there something you can do to lean into ease and comfort in this moment? So outdoor therapy programs can be a place to practice new skills and new ways of being, and to connect with community and to the land, to form webs of safety and belonging, to reclaim pleasure, leisure, rest, play, connection, joy, song and dance and movement. And they can be spaces where we can gather hope and resilience, the kind that percolates down to the everyday and gives us the energy to make different choices and generate sustainable actions that align with our visions and values for our planet. And now I'd just like to show a very, very short video that really, I think, is basically a montage of little moments that from our program that represent all of that, what we've spoken about. So thank you.
Okay, we're sharing the screen, so Tanya has video to share with all of us. Is it visible on the screen? Thank you for giving us a portal to what your world looks like on a day-to-day basis. And I think you really made an important point. I think we all know it innately, but we lose ourselves in nature, but we also find ourselves, right? I mean, and also how nature really heals us, and it's really nature-based therapy is a thing to sort of work with trauma healing. So thank you for bringing home that point. Since we're a little short on time, I have to quickly move to Raj. So today we deal with a spectrum of emotions ranging from anger, helplessness, and anxiety induced by the state of our environment today. What also strikes me is this: in this situation, how can therapists, like mental health practitioners, be more equipped to deal with such complex emotions which rarely emerge from structural problems? And what about the affordability part of it, right? Because we all are aware of the mental health financial struggles that a lot of people have to face. Is there financial support available for mental health interventions, particularly for the most vulnerable? To unpack some of these questions, I invite Raj Mariwala. A very brief bio. Raj is the director for Mariwala Health Initiative, a funding organization working on equitable mental health access. They're also the editor for The Reframe, a journal series uncovering the intersection of mental health and climate justice, which is one of a kind in India. So you guys should really check it out. Raj, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I must say that I may not look directly into the camera because I live with a mental health condition. And so I'll just put that out there. But also, I think many people who have spoken before me have said a lot of important things. So I'll try not to repeat. But I think before we talk really about, I would say, solutions or therapy, it's very important to reiterate that there is a big disconnect, and partly my co-panelists have spoken about it, that both the mental health discourse and the climate change discourse is Eurocentric, and by that I mean white, able-bodied, cis heterosexual male, and it's very expert-led, but it also reflects very privileged narratives that then promote individual solutions. So the moment that we say that some of the solutions could be talk therapy or psychiatry, that's a bit of a problem because we are still focusing then on the biological. And here's, I'll use an example to illustrate, because there's a lot of jargon in mental health. Speaking about indigenous communities or Adivasi community mental health, if you look at any systematic review anywhere in the world, but in India as well, most reviews will say substance abuse is the major mental health issue faced by tribal communities, which means then our kind of solutions fall only to two brackets: talk therapy, counseling, psychiatry, right? This doesn't allow us, for example, to look at a more psychosocial approach, which recognizes that systemic barriers and marginalizations specific to particular contexts affect people's well-being. So the moment I say that, how is it going to help us reframe this? Of course, for indigenous communities, the loss of land and place, ecological changes over time, they have led to complex grief, loss of identity. And of course, then these disruptions and stressors are linked to substance dependency as a coping mechanism, distress, suicidal ideation, social isolation, and depression. So it's very important to actually step back a little bit and see that first, our role as those who are part of mental health structures is not to further marginalize indigenous communities. And I'm speaking specific to this example, but I also want to make a point that this is possibly the reason why that biodiversity and health, be it overall health, physical health, or mental health, is sidelined in climate change conversations. It's why we don't recognize that indigenous people care for approximately 80% of the Earth's biodiversity, despite inhabiting a rapidly shrinking 22% of the Earth's surface, right? So first, for mental health, I think we really need to critically engage with and question some of these structures and look at how to do this psychosocially, look at how to do psychosocial justice. And also for both discourses, really question neoliberalism and profit motives as something that contributes to, I think, further oppression and violence in both climate change discourses and mental health discourses. Right. And, we don't hear that much about changes in marine populations or insect populations and the knock on health factors such as diarrheal diseases, malaria, suicidal ideation. Now, from a mental health perspective, I was doing some reading, and the more papers and research one reads, you find out that the value of biodiversity and human life or human health has been referred to as a non-market impact. Conversely, if you look at it the other way, we look at the inbuilt ableism in mental health, because in 2020, figures said that the costs of poor mental health and reduced productivity are going to be 6 trillion by 2030. So look at both sides. And that's why we have the disconnect. And that's why, for those of us in mental health, I think before we talk about services or anything else, we really have to foreground the idea that our well-being and our mental health are intimately tied to the health of our ecosystems. And if we are to do mental health work properly, it is imperative for us to challenge structural inequalities, counter systems of privilege and power, and to build solidarity and allyship. Especially because psychology is in danger of us obfuscating like the major issues. The danger of climate anxiety becoming a pathologizing term, the danger of climate anxiety individualizing distress, further obscures the violence of neoliberal systems that affect both things. So I think when it comes to therapy or mental health services, we need to radically re-envision mental health care, what care even means, both in policy and services for biodiversity loss and climate-induced distress. And thus, first, mental health advocacy needs to rally for more than just therapeutic access and clinician rooms. In all mental health interventions, we need to incorporate a rights-based lens and equip practitioners to respond to structures of oppression that are socio-cultural, economic, geopolitical, and policy-based, right? Because otherwise, if we don't do this and we don't recognize that mainstream frameworks of mental health can perpetuate distress, trauma, and oppression of marginalized communities. And I don't mean only indigenous communities, but also disabled, Dalit, queer, trans, and other historically marginalized communities. So before we talk about the funding for these things, we have to navigate climate distress through affirmative lenses informed by knowledge and lived experience from the margins, understanding of class and caste inequalities, historical uprooting, generational loss, colonial history, extractivist politics, racial, casteist, gendered inaccessibility to recourse of violence, right? And so now I'll move to services and say that our clinical work at a more kind of tangible level, we really need to look at psychosocial justice and building networks and linkages towards tangible avenues of livelihood, housing rights, food security, but also those who live in conflict zones, disaster areas, those who are refugees, and really look at empowerment and building the capacity for agency and resilience, agency and resistance as a new way to think about resilience. And I'll give you some examples. Income transfers, just plain income transfers to vulnerable communities have shown to be a good protective measure for suicidal ideation. Some of the programs that we work with farming communities who, yes, offer counseling support, helpline, led by those communities, by farming communities themselves, but also linkages to different government schemes, to different welfare schemes, to debt relief. Similarly, so for fishing communities, I think one of my co-panelists spoke about primary kind of, communities engaged in primary resource sectors. And it's very important to look at social development alongside whatever psychological support and care one is providing, unless we work together intersectorally, intersectionally, and provide linkages to livelihood, education, working with youth and women's groups, looking after physical health needs as well, we will not actually be, I think, doing justice to this and continue to reinforce those same hegemonic dynamics. Because in the end, for mental health, when it comes to biodiversity loss, whatever support we have, and there is funding for this, but I would say two other funders who may or may not be in the room, I'm being positive here that some may be in the room. The funding, when it comes to this particular intersection, must go, instead of perpetuating extractive dynamics, hegemonic systems, and neoliberal systems, whatever funding, whatever services must be connected to community struggles and feed into any sort of processes and resistance that contests all of these powers. So I think I'll end there. I'm not sure how much time I have left. If I have time, I'll talk more.
We don't, but we
Okay,
don't.
that's fine. No, that's
you
fine.
might
I'm
want
good.
to respond to a question that our attendees have sent in. So that's also one way to keep the conversation going.
Cool.
Thank you so much. I'm really at a loss right now because I feel like you have, in some ways, also synthesized the whole conversation so well. I mean, you helped us really zoom out a bit and really piece everything together and really called out the elephant in the room. And I really agree with you how, as the discourse evolves, we need to take certain radical departures, right, from the business as usual and not really pathologize, individualize problems that are so systemic, right? And it more so happens for the most marginalized communities, right, to sort of individualize them, while we really need the psychosocial support, as you really pointed to. So thank you, Raj. That was really hard hitting. So now I want to really open the floor for the panelists to sort of respond to each other in case they want to double click on anything that they feel like we kind of missed out on. So we could have a minute for that, and then we could take questions from the audience. So any panelist wants to sort of comment? Raj, this is the window if you want to add something, or Pavitra, Tanya, Gauri. Okay, so I'll take the questions, right? One of the questions that we've got is, how does gender play a role in the impact of anxiety? Is it similar, different for different genders experiencing the crisis? Anyone who wants to take this question? Raj, do you want to take this up and speak a bit about MHI work, how you guys look at it?
I mean, if the mental health practitioners in the room want to speak to it, since I'm not a mental health practitioner, I approach this from a lived experience lens, but maybe the mental health practitioners want to answer this first.
Yeah, Pavitra, Tanya. Tanya, would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah, I can give it a go. So again, I have maybe what I'm sharing doesn't come from like the research, but just from interaction with people across genders. And I definitely think that the queer community is impacted differently. The impact is different across genders in different ways. Like I think even when we look at the Gaddi community, and men and women are impacted maybe differently based on the roles they play and their involvement and relationship with nature in that sense. But based on my programs and interactions with people, I think everyone is impacted by eco-anxiety. I don't think in that sense it's very different, but yeah, I'd love to hear from Pavitra as well if she'd like to add.
Yeah, and maybe Pavitra, there's another question which sort of goes up in your alley. So it says, what are the ways of building resilience among communities for facing biodiversity loss from a mental health point of view? So you would want to maybe expand on what you spoke towards the end of your commentary.
Sure. Maybe I'll go for the second question first and then.
Yeah, sure.
When we talk about resilience, it's usually looked at something that we look at from the outside to the inside. But resilience is something that's very inherent, but we've given it like such a large umbrella term where we kind of want to pick and identify. But I think what we would want to do when we discuss resilience in communities is to like really like ask these questions to community members to see what are some of the factors that give hope, aspirations, and like kind of ground them. So I don't think I can represent a community narrative of a marginalized person. But I guess it's in this discourse of where we would want to ask this question from and what we are trying to visualize through these questions. So that's a roundabout way of saying that I wouldn't have a direct answer to that question, but I think the question is directed to asking the community members themselves to be like, how does social support networks enhance your everyday living? What would you want to be different? What are your hopes for your future? And what grounds you and roots you in these practices every day?
Yeah, thanks for your response. There's one question pointed towards Gauri. So are there any support action groups to deal with these issues specifically? Maybe not exclusively, could be a mix of external activism as well as mutual support. How would you like to respond to that question, Gauri?
So I'll start off by saying about how anxiety in general, not just eco-anxiety, but anxiety in general is treated towards in the Indian context. Like there's not much discourse over all of the mental health conditions that different people go through. Like not just anxiety in particular, but just the conversation of mental health in general. It's still very, it's not at the level that it should be. And when it comes to eco-anxiety specifically, people treat it like it's something that's just made up. And like I've had personal experiences with people that say that, you cannot actually say that eco-anxiety is an actual thing. There are people who actually really struggle with anxiety and you're comparing your experiences with them. So that just does not add up. It's like, it's an unethical thing to do. So when you receive that kind of discourse over issues like eco-anxiety, it sort of really dims down your hope for things and also trivializes what you're going through. The only support that I have personally received is from climate action groups, Youth for Climate India, which I'm a part of. We have always encouraged open discussions on eco-anxiety, and at our Climate Justice Library in Delhi, we held a session for the community as well, to speak up about the issue and also share their own personal experiences. 2 of our team members were featured on the Vice Group's news article on eco-anxiety. And if you guys want, I can share the article's link with you. And yeah, I think personally just connecting with like-minded people and reaching out to groups that are actively involved in the environmental movement and the climate justice movement at large, I think that they will be able to understand what you're going through better. And I'm pretty sure that there are therapists who deal specifically with anxiety relating to ecological matters. To my knowledge, like I'm really not sure, but if we delve more into it and if you guys reach out to climate action groups, I'm pretty sure you will get many leads.
Thank you for your response. I think we'll close the Q&A session since we are also running out of time. But thank you, each one of you. What I see a running theme across all your commentaries that, this is a problem so big and we might be all affected by it in different degrees, but the only way out is to work together, to build solidarities and to see the problem as it is and not sort of reduce and diminish it to an individual problem and not just pathologize people. right? So thank you so much. And on that note, I also want to invite our coordinator, Dr. Ravi Chellam, to give a vote of thanks to the wonderful people who've been part of today's conversation. Over to you, Ravi.
Thanks, Aditi. I'm still processing much of the rich conversation. I mean, I have some passing familiarity with issues related to mental health since we have a counselor in the family. But I want to begin by thanking Gauri, Pavitra, Tanya, and Raj for agreeing, accepting our invitation, and throwing everything into the short time that we were able to give them. I also want to thank the large, diverse audience, not just for attending, but actively engaging through several comments and questions. This has been one of the more active chat groups we've had, let us say. And of course, want to thank the team that's made this possible. Aditi took the lead on this with able assistance from Nimisha, Pratama, Nivedita, and Anindo, and our two interns, Dhruv and Lisa, and tech support from Gautam, and of course, the support from Rohini Nilakani Philanthropies, which makes it all possible. There have been a few queries wanting to link with us. The Biodiversity Collaborative website is there. There's a contact email address. I've shared my email address with a few of you. Let's keep in touch. One thing that is coming through is that these are complex issues. These are complicated issues, not just the one we've had. The one on agriculture and biodiversity also had a lot of interest. And some note for us is to make sure that we actually set up follow-up conversations. We might want to do these conversations much more frequently so that the engagement continues. Not only with the audience that attends the first time, but maybe even attract fresh audiences. Take care, keep safe, all of you. Good evening. Bye.
Take care, guys.